Bob Belshaw, Director of Business Development at Falcon Group, discusses the business benefits of tight-knit collaboration between finance and supply chain teams, right now on the Agile Supply Chain Podcast.
Bob, welcome to almost a new generation of our Thought Leader series on supply chain and Agile, and the Agile Supply Chain Credo that we've done. It's pretty exciting to have some of the finance community start to weigh in on this. You and I were joking before the time, and we said, supply chain is full of engineers, and engineers are classically petrified of finance. And so that doesn't help, because ultimately the reason we do supply chain is to support the business growth model. So I'm Roddy. We've known each other for many years. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and then we will fire away and get going. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you, Roddy. It's great to be here. I'm Bob Belshaw. I'm a supply chain finance convert. Recently joined Falcon Group, a UK trading company that buys, holds, and sells inventory. Prior to that, I spent 15 years at GE Capital and BNP Paribas, providing finance solutions to the supply chain. And going way back, I was ran a little software consulting company in the supply chain, a lot of network design and optimization. So I think I've got a real appreciation of some of the stuff Roddy and team are looking to talk about, bringing finance and supply chains together.
That's awesome. And actually, I've had you in discussions and panels before, and I've really appreciated because of that inherent understanding of supply chain. I think I shared with you a note yesterday that someone said, well, control towers, they're great because they show us events, and events show us where the inventory is. Therefore, finance must love control towers. Well, it's not quite that simple, right? And I mean, as we know, as the business is trying to pivot from supply driven, where finance and inventory and assets are absolutely critical, moving to demand driven, which is all about the growth model of the business. Anyway, so Bob, just in terms of the Agile Supply Chain Credo, which you've had a look at, and we got lots of input from all over the industry, McKinsey's, Accenture's, and all the cast of characters. What really popped out at you as a finance person? What popped out of the credo for you?
Well, Roddy, the credo in general and the principles really hit home as a group. But, I think it was the discussion on the resiliency and responsiveness. It's the part of supply chains that I think there's so much opportunity to do better and to connect across the board. So, that one struck me. I think as we've lived through this pandemic, it's become clear that, a rigid view of finance can have some significant ramifications when the unpredictable happens. So, to me, that's where we've got to sort of understand what our financial discipline does and what its impact is on both the service we provide and our ability to respond to crises. So,
and that's a really good point, because, and again, this is not about beating up ERP, but I think most companies have invested a lot of their IT strategy in putting in one big ERP system. Forget about who the vendor is, but it's a big ERP system. And ERP vendors and systems are great because they collect massive amount of data. They've got all the transactions, and at any point in time, you can push a button and theoretically get a cost or a plan or a future-looking perspective out of it. But it's not enough. And I think, why I say and why I'm hearing more and more in the industry, ERP was sufficient at the time because we had systems doing HR and procurement and finance and materials management and capacity planning and asset management all spread out. We at least put them in one box. So we now have one view of that one box, but it's a very supply-driven box. It works to the tune of forecasts that are coming in. So, in the sort of 5-stage maturity model, pivoting from supply driven to demand driven, how does finance see that? How's finance responding to that? Because I think finance must be sitting saying, oh my gosh, I got all these assets and I know how much they're worth and how much inventory I've got, but I don't know this demand forecast accuracy at 60%. How the hell do I do finance with that?
I think I think the point that I really took from the last thing you said, Roddy, is ERP is sort of built to look within and not connect. And when you think about the changes in supply chains, it is so many manufacturers are not vertically integrated anymore, and so their dependency and their ability to respond is dependent on hundreds of their suppliers, and so I think when you explore where finance is coming from, I think the record keeping is strong, but it's the understanding of what needs to be done to change the responsiveness. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, there's a ton of inventory in the industry. The top 30 providers, it's probably north of 115, $120 billion. But responsiveness is about having the right inventory in the right place at the right time, and I think that's where the gap is for finance. They're saying, well, we've got a lot of inventory. Why aren't we responsive? What's missing?
Right. And I think it's a really good point, because at the end of the day, disruptions happen. We can't. I read a great paper from INSEAD, IMD in Europe, and this professor said, forget about this hype about we're living in the new norm. Nonsense. The new norm is that there's going to be disruptions. There always has been disruptions, and there will be bigger disruptions go forward. We see them faster, and we see the impact of them much faster. So forget about the fact that it's suddenly disruptions are on the scene. Now, your comment about resilience is exactly the point that is quite scary, and that is, if I'm a 300-day inventory pharmaceutical company, and something goes wrong at the wrong point in my network at the wrong point in time, that 300 days worth of inventory is useless. I first of all got to find it. Second of all, I got to ship it. It might have an expiry date on its head. And so, there's a really good chance that I don't get it to where it needs to be. And I think that's what you've seen. And in a sense, the pandemic has not only really put a constraint on the supply side, but it's also had to put a constraint on the demand side. I mean, we're talking about vaccines doesn't equal vaccinations, and so what's gonna happen is we're gonna have this massive variability on the demand side, and we've got this massive variability potentially on the supply side, and somehow someone has to plan and manage the finance around this, because the business doesn't stop working with finance. Finance is still the engine, the oil that makes the engine turn around. So, I mean, what would you, if I said to you, what pressures do you think are on the finance community to do something different going forward? I mean, there's that old expression that says, you want the same, you do the same. You want something different, you got to do some things differently. What is that differently for finance?
Well, I think it's where we started our discussion today. It's that innate knowledge of the business and how the end-to-end supply chain responds. And I think the way you measure that and the way you impose your will as a finance organization on supply chain and procurement has to allow for that view. And that isn't the model is typically, how do we reduce inventory? How do we take cost out? And I think if you don't look in that end-to-end view and say, how do we respond? How do we compete with the best service? How do we manage our business? And that may mean different things to finance. And I think finance has to make that understanding and come to really do that, so they can guide with their their targets. If we're trying to improve cash to cash, we're trying to reduce inventory. Is that the right thing? Well, it conceptually is, when nothing's going wrong. But if you look at the variability of our supply chains, these are long supply chains. And if you introduce variability at any point, you've got to have an ability to respond. So I think in the end, finance has a huge impact with the guidelines they set on the organization's ability to generate revenue and service their customers. So I think it's a little bit of a holistic view that bridge has to get tighter and tighter.
I think so. We're at a brilliant point, because just before the call, we were talking about, in my engineering days, we did courses at university on, how you speak to finance. And your point was, well, finance are actually learning how to speak to engineers. And I think that actually is quite a profound insight, because it's much easier for an engineer mired in the detail of engineering, everything's important. And the finance people are going to say, holy mackerel, I don't need all that stuff, right? It's most of it's the wrong stuff anyway. Whereas finance knows what's really important to finance. And if finance can put supply chain in the language of finance to the engineers, you're probably going to have a much better resonance and a much better understanding of finance in the engineering community. And I mean, I think that's a profound comment, as simple as it may seem.
No, I having spent the last 15 years in this sort of world of third-party inventory and coming in and working with corporates, I found that finance is really interested in why they have the inventory, and they're asking, very logical questions. We keep trying to push the numbers down, but it seems like we have more inventory and our service isn't up. What's wrong? What could we do differently? And so they're asking different questions, and it's clear to me it depends on that individual corporate supply chain, its type of products, all sorts of things that enter into how this has to look, and finance can bring a lot to the party in those discussions where I think, to your point, when you're looking at all these moving parts in an end-to-end global supply chain, it's very easy to just get buried in the details. But some different policy decisions can have, I think, a tremendous ramification on their ability to deliver.
And when you think about it, actually, customer back to supply makes more sense to finance than supply to the patient, right? Because
right.
At the end of the day, to your exact point, is why is all this inventory scattered all over the supply chain? It doesn't make any sense. So let's cut it in half. And oh my gosh, we just cut our on time and full to patients because we didn't realize that was a really critical part of the supply chain. So in actual fact, the whole credo that talks about patient driven, everything is translated from the patient back. And if there is a disruptive event in the supply chain, figure out what the impact on the patient is. And I
right.
think that fits the finance model much better than simply looking at, let's cut costs and let's cut inventory and let's cut assets, because you don't necessarily know how critical they are in the total picture. I mean, it's so simple for me as an engineer, it's almost stupid. But for you as a finance person, you might say, well, this is not pretty exciting. This is just straightforward how finance operates. So as we get to the end of this, I mean, one thing I'm going to ask you to do is, if you had to come up with a stop and a start. So there's going to be a varied audience of people watching this interview, and some of them supply chain, some business leaders, etc. What would you start off by saying, look, this is what you have to stop doing? And obviously the start is the converse, but maybe there's a start that you need to think differently about. What would those be, Bob?
Wow, that's Ronnie. That's a really interesting, thought-provoking question. I think I would say to finance, you need to really stop setting arbitrary types of working capital metrics that you're going to measure. I think you need to have your team help you make that leap into where the inventory, where the cost, where the responsiveness is. So I think rethinking that whole that whole model is really where I'd recommend. There's lots of things you can throw out, but when you start to understand where your supply chain's vulnerable, what you can do as a finance leader, and some of it's a trade-off. I remember with a lot of supply chains when they first started going global, they just didn't have enough safety stock, and plants were being shut down because of the variability, and then you nudge along and sort of tune something. But I think rethinking how they set those goals, because they're answering to Wall Street and what the market may want, but ultimately you've got to be responding to the customer. And I think if you're responding to your customers, you're going to deliver the revenue and the cost at the right approach.
That's a profound comment, as simple as it may be, and that is, finance, go and understand the supply chain with the engineers, with the supply chain leaders, and find out where the critical parts are, and then work back to your goals, because you can come to much more meaningful goals if you do it that way than simply say, well, that looks like a lot of inventory, so let's cut it in half. Meanwhile, it's the most critical point in the supply chain, and you end up by destroying the flow of the product through the supply chain. It's a simple point, but I think it's a profound one. And I mean, it does mean that finance should sit in with supply chain strategy and understand what they're trying to do, because this is not about, thank you for your supply chain strategy, we'll now see where we can cut some costs out of it, because I think that's what the engineers and the supply chain community think is going to happen. So I think
it's funny, Roddy, if I can just jump on that one point. The best in class providers that I've corporates out there have set up cross-functional teams having those issues, where many times the CFO is leading the discussion, and there's the head of procurement, supply chain are all part of it, because clearly the working capital is so much of it is driven in the supply chain in practice. But if they're setting policies and we don't want inventory on our balance sheet, so we force the supplier to hold more inventory and our costs go up, there's ramifications to these decisions, and they need to be together on those types of topics, because I think, to your point, it clears out what the organization's doing. It sets clear goals then that meet everybody's needs. So
I think that this is a profound discussion. So even though we've come up with 3 or 4 very simple points of view, I think what it points to is the supply chain community has to reach out to finance and bring them into the discussion much, much earlier than what's been done before. And I think it's going to get worse, because as we go into cell and gene therapy, where you're no longer making millions of tablets for millions of patients, you're making one very expensive cure for maybe 10 patients. And if you get the inventory story wrong, the numbers are big. And the consequences can be quite serious. I mean, I think this is exactly validated why I thought that we would get huge value, even if this is how to learn about your finance community step 1, and maybe there's a 5-step process here that we need to go through. But Bob, thank you very much. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing? I mean, any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, Rodney, thank you so much for being here. I just like to say that I think the view that you are talking and that we hit on a lot today was looking at that customer, and I think it's so, to your point, it is obvious, but it's so easy to take your eye off that ball. And having worked with a lot of finance procurement groups together, there's a lot to be gained. There's tons of opportunities, and as they work together, I think the opportunities to be more resilient, to be more flexible, to provide outstanding service are all there, and to have plans in place for various types of pandemics and disasters. It's just a question of getting your arms around it and understanding. I'm sole sourcing. That's a 3,000-mile leg. I've got inventory. It's going to go obsolete. Those trade-offs should all be on the table, I think. So I think these discussions, it was fun to be part of it. So I appreciate it.